Hey guys, welcome back to another edition of the Cool Sports Network. I am your host, Chase Coburn, and today I am joined by a very special guest, a writer for Ravens Wire and the host of Locked On Ravens, Kevin Oestreicher. Kevin, welcome to the show.
I appreciate you having me, Chase. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm just excited that football's back. That's the biggest thing for me. Is it was a long off season. Now that football's back, I can finally get back into the swing of things, and it's an exciting time.
Absolutely. I think every football team, whether you're a Chiefs fan or whether you're a Panthers fan, gosh, I feel sorry for them at this point. But I think
Yeah.
we're all happy that football is back at this current time. But for people and listeners who aren't as familiar with your work, explain exactly what you do covering the Ravens before we get to the ins and outs of this football team.
Sure, yeah. So this is my sixth season covering the Ravens and have been doing a lot with it. Just, of course, writing for Ravens Wire. I've been in and out of a couple of different roles there, and I've loved my time writing for them and for USA Today, whether it's, transcribing quotes, putting together pieces for who the Ravens should sign or trade for, just general pieces as well. So USA Today's been great. And then I host and produce Locked On Ravens. So that's a daily 5-day-a-week podcast. We go Monday through Friday. Then we also go live after games and pieces of big news and everything of the sort. And it's been really fun, especially building up communities and being able to do that. I also do some work over at Bleacher Report and have just dabbled in the baseball scene as well with the Ryan Ripken show and going on with him and his crew. And we also cover the Ravens and football over there. But my life has been very Ravens-centric over the past 6 years.
I mean, is that how you grew up? Was that your start? You grew up around Baltimore? How did Ravens become such a center of your life?
Yeah, so I grew up in Baltimore, been a lifelong Ravens fan, and it's just football is something I've always loved. And I'm a huge sports guy, so obviously with the Orioles, that's my team, and I'm actually a Denver Nuggets fan. It's a little known fact about me. Is
Okay.
Baltimore doesn't have a team. I feel like everybody
Right.
goes over to the Wizards, and everybody's like, all right, well, Washington,
Yeah.
I'm just gonna go root for the Wizards. But me, when I think I was maybe 6 or 7, I wanted a favorite basketball team, and I was like, hey, Nuggets is a funny name. I like that name. And so I'm like, all right, you know what? This is my team, and I've stuck with it. And obviously was rewarded with the championship a couple of years ago there. But Ravens and Orioles, obviously, I'm a big Baltimore guy. And really, Baltimore's been a big part of my life. And I'm blessed to have seen a lot of really good Ravens teams over the years.
It's been a huge part of my life as well. My dad grew up in Ellicott City, so 20 minutes out of
All
Baltimore.
right.
So I'm a
Yeah.
Baltimore guy. And I do go over to DC. I actually have a podcast called Wiz Talk with Chase. So I'm a
Oh,
diehard Ravens
nice.
fan. It's a rough life. I'm sure it's more fun having Nikola Jokic and now extended Jamal
Well,
Murray.
I will thank you for Contavious Caldwell Pope and Ish Smith on the championship run. I appreciate your
Or
contribution to
Jeff
it.
Green, Thomas Bryant. You guys are the Denver
Yeah,
Wizards.
yeah,
Yeah.
we had all the four. It seems like that's a trend, though. It seems like on every championship team, there's at least one former Wizard. At least recently, that's kind of been the
It
thing.
tells you there are talented players. They just executing everywhere else but DC.
Exactly.
Let's move away from basketball. We're here to talk about football,
Yeah.
and that is the Baltimore Ravens. And we're obviously going to talk about this year's team, what they can accomplish this year, the moves that they've made, and while obviously it's the same core pieces between whether it's the coaching staff, all the coaches who left, or a lot of the free agents that departed in the offseason, this is a different team, but again, with these same core pieces. I do want to talk about last year's team, though, because as a Ravens fan and someone who has covered the team for a while now, it was a little frustrating to see a team as dominant as Baltimore. I believe one of the most dominant regular season teams ever with their point differential and how dominant they were on both sides of the ball. Look at their coaching staff, how many coaches have left for bigger opportunities.
Yeah.
But we all know the story. They fell short to Kansas City, whether it was a strip fumble or the Zay Flowers fumble or running the ball 6 times to running backs. It all fell apart. What do you attribute the Ravens' lack of postseason success last year to?
Yeah, I think to me, they kind of got in over their heads, it felt like, and abandoned their entire identity. They got there by obviously pairing their dominant run game with their passing offense and used them both hand in hand. But once Kansas City came into the picture, it really felt like Steve Spagnuolo was able to kind of put the Ravens in the palm of his hand and have them do whatever he wanted to do. In the run game, they had instances of success in that playoff game, where we saw Lamar Jackson almost take one of the house on 4th and 1. Gus Edwards on I think the very next play did the exact same thing. Yeah. But then Baltimore, that game, it looked like early, Chase, it was going to be like this 35-32 shootout because it was 7-0, then 7-7, then 14-7. And I feel like the Ravens were like, oh no, we can't do what we do in order to keep up with this. It even wasn't that high-powered of an offense last year compared to other Kansas City offenses that we had seen with Tyreek Hill, et cetera. It was really the Chiefs' defense that carried them that season. But it felt like once the Ravens started to see their offense sputter, it's almost kind of like what we saw in week 1, where they dominated with Derrick Henry on the ground. Chiefs kind of do their thing, and the Ravens go away from the run game. Again, obviously not as bad as the AFC Championship game, but you got there running the ball. You got there being one of the most historic rushing offenses. They've had multiple of those years, but this 2023 season with Gus and everybody that they had, they should have stuck to their identity, and I think the Ravens got a little bit flustered with it. Obviously, Lamar Jackson didn't play up to the standard that he needed to as well. With a couple turnovers, Zay Flowers with that costly fumble at the goal line. So the Ravens had an opportunity to win. That defense tightened up in the second half and didn't allow a single point, and they still couldn't pull it out. So they made the AFC Championship. That was growth because they hadn't made that since the 2012-2013 Super Bowl year. But obviously with this team and Lamar, every year you don't win the Super Bowl, just like any other star quarterback, you waste a year of his prime, and Lamar's certainly in it right now.
Right, and especially for someone like Lamar Jackson and how mobile he is and how much his game benefits from being able to rush the football. These prime years where he is 26, 27, 28 years old, 29, really before he reaches that age of 30, these are the key years where you really hope you can capitalize with Lamar Jackson, because if he isn't as good of a pocket thrower as a guy like Mahomes or Josh Allen, and he can't use his rushing ability as much, it is going to hurt his game for the future. But we all know about Lamar Jackson. That's why he's a two-time league MVP. And I think why is he's just a super dynamic player who can win you a game at literally any time. What do you see when you're watching Lamar that maybe not as many people think that makes him such a special player?
Yeah, there are so many ways that I can go with this, but the main one is just the unique blend of everything he brings to the table. Obviously, we can talk about his dynamic ability as an athlete, as you mentioned, but the way that he pairs it with his arm, and the fact that for him, he can work over the middle of the field very well. He can work outside the numbers in between. Whatever you want to do with him, he is able to do it. And I think in Baltimore, at least for me, there are just so many incredible plays. Like, for example, that Isaiah Likely touchdown where, he scrambles out a little bit, waits and finds them. And plays like that, you almost become a little bit numb watching Lamar, where you always got to appreciate the greatness. But you're like, man, we see that almost on a weekly basis from him. And so other NFL fans are like, whoa, like that's crazy. But, if you're watching this team, as a fan covering it, media, whatever it is, you see that all the time. And so we're kind of numb to Lamar's greatness almost. And that's crazy to think about because there aren't a lot of people, if any, that can do what Lamar Jackson does on that field. And to him, a two-time MVP winner, someone who's broken multiple league and franchise records, the most important part of his growth has been the ability to kind of adapt his game. And this does go into the body transformations he's undergone, whether it's gaining weight, losing it, but just him evolving over the years, him now having more control over the offense, which he didn't really have when Greg Roman was the offensive coordinator. We're seeing him continue to blossom year after year. And while there are certainly flaws, as every quarterback has, I think that overall, look, I mean, there was that whole conversation a couple off seasons ago of all these teams when Lamar was, exploring his options about, they should trade for him. They should, and nobody really wanted him. But I think if you were an NFL team, you'd be foolish not to want Lamar on that side.
Yeah, again, you're right. Every quarterback has their falters, but Lamar continues. One of the things I find interesting, as you said, he just continues to improve every year in at least one facet of his game. What I saw in week one, they showed him multiple times on the broadcast. Lamar's more of a leader now, and you talked about kind of having more of the control of the offense, whether it was talking to the offensive line. I think he was talking to the receivers at one point. Like Lamar, they always used to say leads by example, and that's good as a leader, but I think Lamar being more of a vocal leader and showing that the guy who's making the most money in the locker room is also the guy who is going to fight and breathe and live and breathe for this football team and then speak up about it as well. I think that was obviously a great thing to see. In week one, the Ravens did unfortunately lose to, again, Kansas City on opening night. It was a toe-to-toe game, unfortunately, for many reasons, why that line hurts with Isaiah Likely's foot just stepping out of bounds on the final play. But you mentioned this on your podcast, and I've mentioned it on my coverage too. I don't hate how the Ravens played. I mean, they came so close to winning in my eyes. What really stood out to you from that week one outing?
I thought they just fought to stay in it. This game could have really gone sideways quickly, especially early on the offense, because it was almost that same game flow where the Ravens go up 7-0, the Chiefs respond, and then the Ravens kind of hit that wall and they turn the ball over a couple of times, one on the Chris Jones strip sack and the other on the fourth down conversion that failed. And that game easily could have been 21-7 before halftime if the defense didn't tighten up and do what the Ravens usually do, which is they don't usually allow you to get stuff over top, take deep shots, and just absolutely score in one or two plays. You have to work for it. You take the short intermediate stuff if you're an offense, you get down into the red zone, you try to score on that Ravens defense, and more often than not, the Ravens defense holds up and it's field goals instead of touchdowns. So instead of a 21-7 game, exactly what happened. And the Ravens go only down 13-7. And it just kept them just in striking distance. The ability for them to work through their offensive issues. And that last drive, I mean, look, they did what they were supposed to do. There have been a lot of conversations over the last couple of seasons with Lamar about him just taking the check down. You know, he goes through his reads, nothing's there. Well, if you have a running back in the flat or a tight end running a short out, just dump it down to that guy and you can pick up 5, 7, 9, whatever amount of yards. You can still do that and gain effective yardage. And on that drive, the Chiefs were saying, we're not going to let you beat us deep. You can take the short stuff. We don't care about that. And so Lamar said, okay, we're going to drive down the field on you. Obviously, it's a couple of throws in the end zone that he would obviously like to have back. But he made the most important one, just Isaiah Likely, a shoe size too big to potentially win that game for the Ravens. So, again, it's like his back-to-back champs. You know, Kansas City's a tough team. Lamar hasn't had a ton of success against Mahomes over the course of his career, and that's for multiple different reasons. But I would much rather have lost the Ravens did as opposed to the way Cincinnati lost or Cleveland or any of those other teams, because Ravens showed fight in that game against a team that unquestionably is a team to beat in the entire NFL. And after watching all of week 1 and kind of seeing how everything unfolded, it's week 1. By the time week 18 rolls around, every team's going to look different. You're kind of shaking the rust off in these early season weeks, especially for the Ravens who don't play their starters in the preseason. This essentially is their preseason, and what a heck of a game to have it against the Kansas City Chiefs. But I do think still that I was impressed with the way Baltimore stayed in the game, fought, certainly some issues to work out, but I expect them to do that over the course of the next couple of weeks.
Yes, and one of the things you mentioned earlier, and it was kind of about Baltimore abandoning the running game in this 27-20 loss. Now, this may come as an unpopular opinion, and we'll talk about the offensive line and some of the troubles that they've had. But to me, I understand, Henry gets whatever it was, 7 carries in the first 2 drives and then finishes with 13. That's not promising. And then you hear John Harbaugh speak to the media, and he's like, well, we didn't bring in Derrick Henry to get 30 carries a game. You watch what J.K. Dobbins does in Los Angeles, and we're just like, why did we waste the money? Let Zeitler go, let Geno go to get Henry. And we could have just had these guys back. Now, to me, I think everything will change. I don't think we should overreact after 1 week. But again, 13 carries after 7 in the first 2 drives or whatever that was, obviously not ideal. Are you afraid about how Baltimore may be able to utilize Derrick Henry? And do you really think that they abandoned the run game too quick with how their offensive line was playing in that week 1 game?
I think they should have established it more early on. I think once the game got to the point it did, especially late in the second quarter and going into the second half, game flow kind of dictated that you weren't going to be able to use Derrick Henry in the way that you wanted him to. That's why you mentioned it right there. They used him a lot early, especially on that first drive. They had 5 carries on that first drive alone. And they scored and it was successful. And that's the exact play that we were talking about over on social media, where that was the play that the Ravens should just spam the entire game.
Great option,
yeah, they had the success. The Chiefs were having to cheat in, put guys in the box, and that edge defender on that 3rd and 1, he cheated in on Derrick Henry, and Lamar said, all right, well, I'm just going to take this around you. Had a lead blocker out in front and Isaiah Likely, and you pick up 10 to 12 yards. And I feel like after that happened, we didn't really see a ton more of it with Derrick Henry. Now, the run blocking also was not great in this game. I thought that Derrick Henry had a guy or two on top of him, really in the offensive backfield on a lot of his carries. And again, that's not necessarily a Derrick Henry thing. But to me, with Henry and Harbaugh's comments, you shouldn't use him 30 times a game. I think that would be, especially with his usage in Tennessee, that would be a lot. But you do have to use him enough. And you have to use him as your bell cow, right? If the Ravens brought him in to be in a platoon with Justice Hill, you shouldn't have brought him in the first place, because he's too talented of a player to do that. And I think Justice Hill's awesome. And obviously we saw had to block Chris Jones on 2 straight plays and actually kind of held his own. And we're like, whoa.
I mean, he's like playing special teams. He's leading the team reception, blocking Chris. It was insane.
Man, he is your do-it-all, literally do-it-all running back. But Henry, even though he's 30, I know that's kind of the scary age everybody looks at with running backs, and you kind of, should you go after that 30-year-old running back? But for him, if you're going to use a guy in a platoon, I would have just brought Gus Edwards back. And there is always the element of Derrick Henry, where he is always going to be a guy that defenses gravitate more towards, as opposed to a Henry or a J.K. Dobbins, because, well, I mean, let's face it, he's Derrick Henry. And that's just kind of what it's almost like, okay, he's Lamar Jackson. Now you have the he's Derrick Henry problem. And that's what we were talking about with, well, you got to lean one way or the other. But if it was Gus or JK, you're kind of always leaning Lamar, because you're like, oh, we know Lamar can beat us, but we're going to hope that Gus and JK can't. With Derrick Henry, both those guys can give you a ton of issues. So for the Ravens, they have to be able to utilize him enough. And 13 carries, I agree. That cannot be what his median or what his average carries are. You have to be able to get him up into that, even if it's like 17 to 19, right? Even if you don't want to go past 20, got to get him up in the high teens at least. I would probably go 21 to 22, depending on game flow, because there will be some games like this. But I would have been more okay with the game flow happening and kind of the underutilization of him if they had tried to establish it earlier in the game. It felt like by the time they were actually running him after that first drive, it was too little too late.
Right. And for context, by the way, for what we were talking about on social media, how we were able to connect, Kevin was posting about how when the Ravens were using Derrick Henry and he was succeeding running the football, it set up all these running lanes for Lamar Jackson. And that's where all these NFL fans are like, how are they going to stop that? Is when both of these pieces are working, and there is really no solution for that. And you're right. I think after the first drive, Baltimore did go away from that. But again, it's week 1. And you mentioned it, the Ravens don't play their guys in the preseason. So I feel like this was like a preseason week 4 / like a week 1 regular season, because it's like they're trying to work out all of these struggles that they did have. But we just mentioned about how you retweeted that post. We're communicating on that. And we saw on Thursday night that even when he's out just running the football, Lamar Jackson is best when he's moving around, right? He's not a pocket passer. He's not Patrick Mahomes or Joe Burrow in that way. We want Lamar Jackson to move, and that's when they succeed. Now, many people are concerned, including me, about the Ravens' offensive line. You lose some pieces. They did not look good, in my opinion, on Thursday night compared to what John Harbaugh said in his post-game press conference. I still believe that it was a very tough day for them. But do you believe those struggles shouldn't be as concerning for Ravens fans, considering that it's going to make Lamar move, and Lamar's better when he moves, if that makes sense? Like that play to Isaiah Likely, the offensive line was terrible, and you just let Lamar run out and he can make things happen. So should Ravens fans be concerned about the O-line, considering Lamar's under center?
I think with the way that they lost 60% of their starters and how they chose to replace them, I think the offensive line will be a concern for the majority, if not all, of the season. Now, I think they're going to get better. I certainly think that there's stuff you factor into it, such as I remember back in that 2022 season, and I talk about this all the time, but when they brought in Kevin Zeitler, he had to miss some time with an injury in his first training camp. Bradley Bozeman, who was starting on that line, had to miss some time. Ronnie Stanley was still recovering from his injury.
Which year are you talking about?
20, yeah, it seems like every single one. You're
Right,
exactly
yeah.
right. But it's that type of thing where you just can't get continuity on the line. I think that's what we saw this offseason too, where Tyler Linderbaum misses most of training camp. He isn't really able, and like it's not a Linderbaum thing, but it's just like being able to get yourself acclimated with new offensive linemen on either side of you. You have young guys, and you're rotating those guys in, trying to find, all right, well, who are we going to start? Because, well, Daniel Falele got some reps, and then all of a sudden you're moving guys around, and Ben Cleveland's getting reps at center, and then you're moving guys to tackle, and you're just like, all these guys are moving all around. So I expected it to be kind of like this. And the pass blocking I didn't think was horrendous. It wasn't necessarily wonderful. I thought the run blocking was the bigger issue to me, especially with Derrick Henry and how he wasn't able to get things going. But to me, a successful season for the Ravens is one where obviously the offensive line is able to, one, protect Lamar Jackson to where he can throw in the pocket. He can sit in there. He can go through his reads and do his stuff. And as a pocket passer, he's somebody that, when he has protection, he can go in there and do his thing. But obviously on the move, he is also, as you mentioned there, Chase, super effective, being able to extend plays. And that's where this kind of street ball thing with a player like Mark Andrews, who didn't have a great game, all things considered, because Kansas City was taking him away out of the game plan. But Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely are two players for the Ravens this season, that tight end position, especially with the personnel that they're going to run, where Lamar gets on the move, and with those bigger bodied defenders out there, assuming they want to go heavy to try to stop the threat of the run, they can't keep up with the Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely once you start getting into 4, 5, 6. And for a defense, if you have to cover every second you have to cover, there's a higher and higher percentage of a chance that a completion gets made, because it's just hard to cover for that long, especially when you have athletic players like that moving around and trying to get open. So the offensive line is a key point. I think obviously the biggest X factor, I know everybody's talking about the new additions and the new starters, but Ronnie Stanley, to me, his health, I mean, this is somebody who is now relied upon as a guy that if he goes out, I mean, I don't even know where you go. I mean, I guess you got to put McCary on the left side and put Rosengarten as a full-time starter on the right. So if they lose anybody, they're in probably a little bit of trouble. And I think I'd be unrealistic to say they won't lose anybody this season, just because injuries happen all across the league. But if they do, they're going to have to figure it out. So the offensive line, I think it will get better, but a little bit of a concern over the course of the season for me.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the things I've been wondering, and even just having these conversations about Baltimore's offensive line since Thursday night, since the terrible preseason, we saw many reporters and writers talking about how that went very poorly in the preseason. We saw that in week one. But as I've been thinking about this, the Ravens have done a great job at drafting offensive line talent, whether it was Ronnie Stanley, Orlando Brown Jr., Ben Powers, and all these other guys. And I think Daniel Falalele and Andrew Voorhees are going to be great players. So they've done a good job at really building these guys. But at the same time, they haven't retained them. Like, I don't think they could just salary wise, but like you couldn't retain Ben Powers, who was doing great things in Denver. I think he's one of the most underrated players in the league. And then obviously you can't retain Zeitler. It looks like the Ravens prioritize the O line in the draft, but then don't prioritize keeping them there. And offensive line doesn't seem like a running back position where you could just filter them out. Do you think Baltimore should utilize keeping more of those O linemen?
I think that they should if they have the funds to. And I think that the big issue with the offensive line market in today's game is everybody needs them. It's why they're not available for trade at the deadline. At least quality ones usually aren't. It's very rare you see that. And it's also why in free agency, we see a lot of these guys getting $100 million contracts, $90 million contracts. And for the Ravens in their particular instance, they have Lamar on that big deal. They have multiple other $100 million players. And it can be tough to go out there and, you're right. You can't keep everybody. But to me, I think a Kevin Zeitler type of signing was one that I thought that they probably should have made. I think that losing two starters on your offensive line, okay. Like that's okay. But three is a lot. And especially when you're losing vets like a Zeitler. And I think I sat there, I think on my show a couple of weeks ago, and I said, man, how different would it have been? How different would the conversation have been on this offensive line if we were having a conversation of left to right, Ronnie Stanley, Andrew Voorhees, Tyler Linderbaum, Kevin Zeitler, and Patrick McCary / Roger Rosengarten. I think a lot of people would feel a lot more confident and comfortable with just one player being the difference there.
Right.
So I think with the Ravens and what happened here, Todd Monken, I feel like, wanted to get younger and more athletic on the line. And I think the Ravens had injury concerns about Morgan Moses. John Simpson did a lot better than a lot of people thought he would, but was still kind of a above average player. So while the expectations were low, it wasn't like he played to the best ability of anyone in the league. So I think they were comfortable enough letting those guys go. And then obviously for Zeitler, they just couldn't come together on a price point. I'm sure both probably wanted to be back with each other, but Zeitler wasn't going to take the pay cut that I think the Ravens wanted him to. So now you're in a situation where for a contending team kind of going through this right now, it's tough. I expect them to invest again heavily in the offensive line in the offseason, going through the draft, even if they win the Super Bowl or don't, because that to me is the biggest need. I think the big thing for them is Ronnie Stanley, him restructuring his contract to essentially chop off that last year of the deal. So now it's kind of the ball is in his court with his play, and the Ravens aren't necessarily tied to him for that extra year if it doesn't go the way that they want it to. But they don't necessarily have a ton of decisions on that line outside of Tyler Linderbaum, who is obviously going to be extension eligible. And yes, they should certainly extend him. That would be an absolute mistake not to. Yeah. So they're gonna have to fork up that money because Creed Humphrey just got paid. But if you have a young offensive lineman who's doing his thing, I think you absolutely should retain him because you want to extend Lamar Jackson's window as much as you can. And part of that is protecting him and making sure that he's able to stay upright.
100%. And I think the offensive line market, you mentioned these $100 million, $90 million contracts. It's important. And there's a lot of value for it in this current day of the NFL. And most days in the NFL, it's just such an important position. And yes, I think prioritizing it will be important. But again, there's Linderbaum and all these other pieces that Baltimore has to pay. A take that I've had on my shows and on my articles for Ravens fans and just people who want to hear about the Ravens in general, they didn't like to hear it. But I thought throughout the entire offseason that they should have released Mark Andrews because I thought that from what we saw in the second half of last year, that Isaiah Likely was good enough to take that jump. Now, Mark Andrews fantasy owners are a little concerned after what Isaiah Likely did on Thursday night because it was incredible. Obviously, that one unlucky break, I mean, an inch away from possibly beating them. But I think 9 catches for over 100 yards and a touchdown for a guy who was coming into the season as the tight end too. That's incredible compared to the 2 receptions, on the other hand, for Mark Andrews. So how do you believe Baltimore will utilize both of them? And do you think that we could be sitting here next year with Mark Andrews having a new home and no longer being tied up to the Ravens?
It's an interesting proposition because at the end of the day, I don't think they can keep both. I think that they're going to have to make a decision. Now, Likely still has a year left on his contract. This is his third season. So there is still room to operate. I think it's such a luxury having both, though. And I know I have 22 leagues. There's a lot of fantasy leagues, but I have Mark
22.
Andrews, 22. I have every player and I play against every player. So that's kind of how it works for me.
On Sundays, do you like put like 9 to 12 block to just edit your fantasy rosters? Or how does that work?
I did today as we were recording this. I went through free agency and just kind of added, everybody who was hot on the free agent market. And I just go scroll, click, add, back, scroll, click. So it's just like it's this whole thing. So to me, with fantasy, I mean, I love it. I love doing the drafts. I love getting all the teams ready. I love the trades and everything. But yeah, it takes a lot because this is the most I've ever had by wide margin. Now Isaiah Likely's available in a couple of these leagues, so I'm trying to pick him up and trying to get. But a lot of these are Ravens leagues, so Lamar goes with like the second pick in the draft, and it's kind of that's kind of how that works. So yeah, right. It's a lot. But I mean, back to Likely and Andrews. Those two to me, you want to use them in your two tight end heavy personnel sets. I mean, it's as clear as day that they should. In the Kansas City game, as we mentioned earlier, the Chiefs were doing everything in their power, and that's the Chiefs' MO, is they take away your best weapon. They make sure that anybody else beats them except that guy. So Andrews, I think, saw the highest double cover rate we have seen in his career, or at least it's up there. So they made it a point to take Andrews out of the game. But if you're the Ravens, you're sitting there and you're saying, okay, that's fine because we do have Isaiah Likely and Zay Flowers is in the equation, and there are multiple other people that can step up for them. But in terms of the future, Andrews, I believe he just signed that extension either a year or 2 years ago. I can't remember exactly when it happened, but Likely's going to be up for a big extension. In my opinion, he could probably start and be the number one tight end on 25, 26 of 32 NFL teams. He's going to have a very robust market. So you have him for next season. I'm sure the Ravens will be trying to sign him to an extension like we have seen, kind of that team-friendly deal. I don't know if Likely will necessarily take that. I feel like if he just waits the year and enters free agency, he could get a contract that would far surpass that. So to me, it's almost like the Roquan Smith, Patrick Queen situation where the Ravens had to choose one. They chose Roquan Smith, and while I'm sure they would have loved to have Patrick Queen back playing next to Roquan and in that role, it's kind of, you have to figure out, well, you can't keep everybody, and you can't invest too much into one particular position because you have to save it for it. If you're investing money into those two tight ends, is there enough room? Because they have other huge extensions coming up, like Linderbaum. Kyle Hamilton is one who's going to get paid in a couple of years. It's going to be Zay Flowers. You're going to have to revisit some other extensions. So money is always free flowing. Money always goes off and comes on the books. But you have to be thinking, this is the job that Eric Acosta has, is you think for this and think for today, but you also have to think 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the line. And while it's such a luxury to have right now, you have to take advantage of it because at the end of the day, I think that whether they choose Andrews or choose Likely, they probably will have to choose one to make sure they have enough money to spend on their other players.
You mentioned Patrick Queen. I mean, on the defense, Baltimore lost a few pieces. You lose Queen, Jadeveon Clowney, AFC's interception leader last year, Geno Smith, and I believe the most important of them all, defensive coordinator Mike Macdonald, who left for a head coaching job in Seattle. Now, just from week one, I don't think we can really overreact. I don't think Baltimore's defense played too poorly or too well to really overreact one way or the other. But what did you see? What have you seen from Baltimore so far that can make you feel, at least at what make Ravens fans feel a little promising that maybe they won't regress, and do believe Zach Orr is good enough to lead a less talented defense to similar success like last year?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I look back on is when Mike Macdonald first started off with the Ravens as their defensive coordinator, coming back from Michigan. He had a couple of rough games to start.
Dolphins,
that Dolphins game, which I know is kind of like forbidden to talk about now in the Baltimore area.
Yeah.
But that was that game where they blew that huge fourth quarter lead, and everybody was like, okay, they tried to hire the hot shot defensive coordinator. It's not working. This is terrible. And people were overreacting to that game. And then week 3, Kyle Hamilton, who also was highly criticized in that Miami game, saves it on Nelson Aguilar. He forced that fumble, and Aguilar was still with the Patriots. And Mike Macdonald really never looked back. And so for Zach Orr, who at least Mike Macdonald had that year at Michigan to call plays, Zach Orr did not have that. Now, he had the playing experience. So that's the difference between the two. But your first ever time calling plays as a coach, it's against Andy Reid, Patrick Mahomes, two-time back-to-back. Well, I guess three-time. They're back-to-back now, but three-time Super Bowl champions. That's a tough opening test, and it's not getting any easier. I mean, I guess Vegas in week 2 will be a little bit of a, easier team, all things considered. But then you got teams like Dallas and Buffalo and Cincinnati. So it's a tough opening season stretch. But I think Orr just has to get his feet under him. And that's okay. He's a young coordinator. I think that they essentially view him as the next Mike Macdonald, someone who has been in that Ravens system for a while, him both as a player and as a coach. And I think we did see the improvements later in the game. For example, early on, they were getting torched by Rashee Rice technically all game in the slot, where they were putting Roquan Smith in there, Malik Harrison, and nobody could stop
slant every time. It was like 5 times he did it. Yeah.
Every single time. But then finally it's okay, Trent Simpson. You're now the will. Go in there. And he was the one who got the pass breakup. We did see a couple miscommunications. Obviously, Marlon passed off Xavier Worthy to nobody, and you can't give Patrick Mahomes any bit of mistake. And that was a very huge one. It was written in the stars the second Marlon passed him off. But I think that with guys like Roquan and Kyle Hamilton, who they admittedly struggled in this game, both of those guys, I expect big bounce backs. And I think they're too talented defensively, especially if you can get contributions from guys like Travis Jones and David Ajabo, those two combined for a sack. If, they play Nate Wiggins a little more, is a little surprised to see Jalen Armour-Davis be in the game as much as he was over a guy like Nate Wiggins. Especially, Xavier Worthy is the speedster, and Nate Wiggins is the speed. This is one of his best qualities. And you're thinking, oh, okay, speed versus speed. Didn't really get to see it a lot. But, yeah, I think to me, at the end of the day, I think the defense will be fine. They lost a lot of talent, like you said, 100%. But to me, it's just being able to stay healthy. And obviously, Kyle Van Noy suffers the eye injury, so we'll see how long he ends up being out for. I think they will target another edge at some point, whether it's in the coming weeks or at the trade deadline. I just think they're going to need somebody. But for now, Zach Orr has a couple ways to get his feet under him. I think after a month, we can try to kind of draw early season trends. But they have talent, and I expect it to at least get a lot better for them, because Kansas City is a tough test for anybody, especially week 1. And like we talked about, Chase, that essentially was their preseason.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're right. I mean, they have so much talent. I believe Zach Orr will do a good job with this defense. You saw what he did with the linebackers and Roquan Smith and Patrick Queen. But even beyond Roquan, you mentioned Kyle Hamilton. He was my preseason defensive player of the year pick. I believe he obviously a tough week 1 start for him, but I believe he can really elevate his play, become that defensive player of the year type player. They re-signed Justin Madubuike, who we had on this podcast. Great person, great football player. And so obviously you have all this talent. I believe they will be all right. Some other people we have had on, we had Ravens play-by-play voice Jerry Sandusky, Baltimore Sun writer Mike Preston. They both agreed on one thing, and that's that Rashad Bateman is definitely viewed in this organization as that possible breakout star. We saw that huge catch down the stretch that I think made us think maybe he could be a dangerous deep threat this year. But outside of Bateman, who else do you view as that player where you can be like, okay, maybe they can break out this year, become that star for Baltimore?
I think to me, Travis Jones, and I just talked about him on the defensive side of the ball, he to me is this player that has all the tools in the world, and someone who I expect to get a lot more playing time this season. I expect them to try to dial back some of the veteran snaps, and we even saw Brent Urban be inactive on Thursday night, so they only went with 4 defensive linemen in that game. But Travis Jones is someone who I still have no idea how he fell to the Ravens in the 3rd round. I saw him go as high as the late 1st, and the Ravens got him in the 3rd. They always seem to find that guy that slides and slides, and they stop that slide, and they benefit from it. And with him, he's a great run stuffer. He's very physical, but obviously as a pass rusher, he bullies offensive linemen. I mean, he's somebody that goes in and will just push a guy all the way back, sometimes even into the quarterback. Like that's how crazy he is, just pushing the offensive lineman back. And I think to me, I don't expect him to necessarily have back when Justin was Justin, now he's Nnamdi, but back when Nnamdi Madubuike had that breakout, I think that, in 2023, everyone's like, whoa, he came out of nowhere. And Madubuike is like doing all this stuff and he's doing all this great things. I don't expect Travis Jones to have the Madubuike breakout, but I expect him to maybe surpass like 6-7 sacks this season. Like, I think that would be a nice, hey, I'm Travis Jones and I'm here type of moment where Madubuike just kind of burst onto the scene. Like, he just burst. He's like, hey, because we had seen it with Madubuike. We had seen him show the flashes, but he just needed more of a plan. he didn't really have a plan. And then
Yeah.
he got the plan, and now we know that Matty BK is the star that he is. Well, for Travis Jones, I think this is a guy that just needs more opportunities and needs to
Yeah.
be able to be on the field more in certain packages because he is a two-way player. He can be a three-down player for you if you need him to. Now, the Ravens have the depth to not necessarily play him every single snap, but I think this season we're going to see a lot of Travis Jones, and I think while I'm not necessarily putting him up on that Matty BK level, I think he's going to have a great year.
I believe so as well. I met Travis Jones at a camp one year. He's an awesome guy,
Oh,
and
nice.
very kind, and yeah, I expect a breakout year from him as well. But something I find interesting is, right, if Travis Jones is a breakout year, you're going to think Baltimore wants to re-sign him. They made a decision that I was a little shocked by. They re-signed Broderick Washington last year. I don't know how that contract. I know it's obviously not a huge deal, but how is that contract going to be worth it for Baltimore? I feel like with Madubuike, with Travis Jones, and then with those veterans that you mentioned, Michael Pierce, Brent Urban, how do you get Washington playing time in that defense?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think to me, Washington, he got rewarded with the extension and he had some level of playing time last season, but he never really flashed. It wasn't like he didn't really do anything wrong. Like he never really was on the
Right.
field for like negative plays, but he also didn't say, oh, Broderick Washington made like three great plays this game. We didn't really
Right.
see that from him. So that deal obviously was not anywhere near what Madubuike got. So there's not the necessarily financial investment that Madubuike is.
Right.
That extension kicked in this season because they signed him. That was the last year of his rookie deal. So they signed him last season. So this is the first year of that deal. I don't know the dead money numbers off the top of my head, but I could maybe see him as a potential trade candidate this offseason, especially if like it might just be best for both sides. And I know that Michael Pierce and Brent Urban, those guys are not, going to stay Ravens for 10 plus years. Their careers are probably coming to a close pretty soon here. So maybe if they feel like next season they can find a bigger role for him and have Madubuike, Jones, and Washington be that initial three, and then you can kind of find another guy in the draft, another guy in free agency, that could be it. But it essentially would be 2 years of not having production from a guy you signed to an extension. And that's that team-friendly thing we were talking about. So again, it's not like a huge financial commitment, but again, you want to play the other guys like a Travis Jones, like Madubuike and Michael Pierce more than Washington at this point.
Right. I think they are more proven. I think they probably are more talented players at this point. We'll see if Washington can really get his foot in there and see how he can produce with that new team-friendly extension he signed last offseason. Let's look ahead to week 2. We're going to talk about a little bit more as we wrap up this episode about what the Ravens can do, some advice you give for as a broadcaster. But when we look ahead in week 2 here for the Baltimore Ravens, I think, their home opener, it comes against the Las Vegas Raiders. This has to be a must-win for Baltimore. And I think this is not a game to get stressed about. We saw Lamar miss practice on Monday. I think he'll be fine. I think he needed another day off after 3 days. Still a little confused about that, but I think he'll be all right for next Sunday. And I think this should, again, be viewed as a must-win game for the Baltimore Ravens. What are you expecting going into week 2, and what are some of the keys to make sure they come out of Las Vegas with a tough stretch against Buffalo, Dallas, and Cincinnati? How do you come out of there saying, all right, we're 1-1?
Yeah, I think the first part you got to do is establish your run game. We talked about it. Establish the run early. The Raiders defense struggled in week 1 with, some former Ravens, J.K. Dobbins. And even though Gus Edwards didn't have the best game, I mean, J.K. had 10 for 135 and a touchdown. And they added a guy like Christian Wilkins in the offseason. They do have Max Crosby and some other defensive linemen, but they're a team that is in this limbo right now. And I think that you have to take advantage and make a statement. I mean, this is a statement game where I think for a lot of people, and you and I, Chase, talked about it, where like we felt okay coming out of that loss, right? It was fine. Like it was back-to-back champs and everything is okay. But if you kind of have this like ugly win against the Raiders, like you're not feeling very good about that because that's a team that for a Super Bowl team with aspirations to get to the Super Bowl, well, against teams like this, you got to beat up on them a little bit and say, well, we know that we're better than you. So establishing your run with Derrick Henry, and if the game flow does dictate it, I could see him getting 22, 24, 25 carries in this game. I would also like to see them get a little more vertical in this game. The deep passing game for the Ravens has been somewhat iffy, in fact, very iffy over the last couple of seasons. Lamar, when he was, first couple of years in the league, he was fine, wasn't great, but wasn't terrible as a deep ball passer. But these last couple of seasons, he has kind of fallen into that bottom tier of the league in deep ball accuracy. And that is not all on Lamar. He has had plenty of drops on those deep balls, especially that Pittsburgh game last season where there were like 80 million of them. So it's not all on the quarterback, but obviously it is still on the quarterback. And that's where the blame will fall. So Lamar had almost 400, maybe even over 400 total yards in that week 1 game against Kansas City. Had almost, it was top 10 in passing yards, but his yards per target, yards per completion, they were down towards the
first half was like 0.8, I believe.
Yeah, towards the very bottom. And I'm sure that Bateman catch very late ended up helping him in that likely touchdown. So for Todd Monken, we even saw this at the beginning last season where he tried to utilize Zay Flowers in all these creative ways that didn't really work, and he was being too horizontal with his offense, and then they tried to open up the passing game a little bit, and that freed things up. So to me, I just think it's making your offense more vertical, maybe take a couple deep shots early in this game, set a tone, keep the defense on their toes, and then for the Ravens defense, just play physical. I think you can play physical. Gardner Minshew was one of the quarterbacks that ended up beating the Ravens last season, and he was a member of the Colts in that game.
Well, I mean, how do you have Zay call for the
I know. That's one. I still look back on those losses.
We're talking about these Pittsburgh, Miami, Colts game. I mean, these are hurt.
No, we're not. We won't go all the way back to those early 2010s when they had some pretty brutal playoff losses. That'd be torture for us. But yeah, I think for the Ravens, you got to be able to play physical, establish your dominance. And I think if you can, kind of like what Roquan said about the Chiefs last week, make them one-dimensional. Take away their run game and make Gardner Minshew throw, or take away their pass game and make them run. I think if you can do that, you have a couple less things to worry about as a defense, and that can help as a whole.
Yes, and I think one of the things that Baltimore does really well is they usually do a good job at not overlooking some of these games. Like Indianapolis clearly overachieved last year. A game on the road against Pittsburgh is hard. Cleveland overachieved. Like some of the losses that we thought were bad at the time actually don't look as bad in retrospect. Obviously, the individual things that happened don't look great, but when you look at who they played, it doesn't look terrible. Usually some of these teams that don't appear to be great, Baltimore does a great job at, I think, getting over those teams. And that's where I think John Harbaugh comes in play with good coaching. I think, to me, if the Ravens just play a safe, smart football game, you don't want to turn it over. You don't want to have this random 10-0 start that you have to come back from and stress about. I think just playing a smart football game for sure. And I think letting Lamar dictate the pace and, letting him decide how this football game goes. But again, also giving it to Derrick Henry. All those are important. I think if they do that, the Ravens can get to 1-1. But you mentioned the tough schedule coming up. Then you have the tough schedule towards the end of the year. You have the road game on Christmas against Houston, and just many different things that are going to happen throughout the season. The Ravens have one of the tougher schedules, or in one of the tougher conferences, in one of the tougher divisions. It's a tough area to play in for Baltimore. They have a lot of tough teams to play, and they are in a very, very tough conference and division. With all of this taken into account, I've talked about all the good and bad from this football team. We've seen their previous postseason success. What are you thinking? What can Baltimore do? What's the ceiling? What's the floor? I mean, what are they going to do? If you're looking at this Baltimore Ravens team one weekend.
Yeah, I think that they still can win the Super Bowl. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and overreact to week 1 and say, well, they lost, the season's done. No, I'm not going to do that. They have the talent. It's going to be a matter of health. I think health plays a huge part, as we've seen with these Baltimore Ravens teams of past. It can derail your season, or if you're healthy enough, it's sometimes just as how healthy are you. And this Ravens team, if they can stay relatively healthy, they have as good of a shot as anybody, but it is going to come down to, can they get over that postseason question? That's what everybody's going to be able to look at with this team. When everybody thinks of this Ravens team, it's, well, we know they're a good regular season team, right? They go out there and they perform and they're consistent, but in the playoffs come around, and in the Lamar Jackson era, they just haven't been able to get the job done. So I think, to me, again, making the AFC Championship, you don't want to take a step back. If you lose in the wild card round, if you lose in the divisional round again, that's taking a step back performance-wise. And I think, to me, that's a disappointing year, because in the regular season, it's great to establish trends, obviously, for seeding and just getting into the dance, but you're ultimately judged on your ability in the playoffs. And while I think that Lamar Jackson, yes, he needs to improve, I don't think the narrative of him never having a good playoff game is true, because we literally saw him last year against the Texans have an incredible game. But in those big moments, he has to be able to be more consistent overall. And that's what it is. If you're consistent across a 3 to 4 game stretch in the playoffs, if you play the best on that 3 to 4 game stretch, you're probably winning. So I think that they can win the Super Bowl. Do they do it? I'm not necessarily sure, but I think that the big X factor is that offensive line, because both in the run game and in the pass game, it just makes a world of difference when you can block for your guys.
Absolutely, Kevin Oestreicher. This has been amazing talking some Ravens football with you today. But obviously, you're already a huge Ravens reporter and writer, and we love listening to you on Locked On Ravens or reading all your articles on Ravens Wire. We really appreciate you coming on. But for someone like me or an aspiring sports broadcaster who wants to get in your shoes, host a podcast, cover a team, write for the team, what would be your biggest piece of advice to an aspiring sports broadcaster or writer like yourself?
Yeah, I just think to be able to get your hat into as many rings as you can, be able to get yourself out there and just put your opinions out. I mean, in this business, you're always going to have people who disagree with you, always going to have people who don't agree with the way you're presenting something or, not agree with the way you do things, but that means you're doing something right because it means people are paying attention to you.
Right. Yeah.
And, you just got to be authentically yourself. And I think that sometimes people can get caught up in, well, I'm just going to say what everybody else is saying and that'll be what I do. But, I think just being your authentic self is the most important part here because at the end of the day, people are tuning into your content for you. It's about your opinions and what you think and what you have to say. And, they don't want you to be somebody else. They want you to be you. So I think what you're doing is awesome, Chase. This has been an incredible time. I had a lot of fun talking football with you and just keep going, man. It'll pay off for you.
Absolutely. And guys, be sure to check out Locked On Ravens and view his all of his Twitter and social media accounts, all of where you can find Kevin. It'll all be in the description below. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us and talking some Ravens. We wish you the best of luck for the rest of the season. We appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Chase. It was a blast.
Thank you so much. All right, audience, we will wrap it up here alongside the host of Locked On Ravens and a writer for Ravens Wire, Kevin Oestreicher. I am your host, Chase Coburn, and we will see you next time right here from the Cool Sports Network. Take